A lovely moment a kid makes the king's guard smile. People from all over the world had gathered around the palace, some sitting on benches nearby, others snapping photos of the impressive building, and a few standing in awe at the sight of the king's guard. The King's Guard was one of the most famous parts of British culture, and every day, without fail, they stood guard outside Buckingham Palace. Dressed in their iconic red coats and large black bearskin hats, they were an unmissable sight. But what truly made the King's Guard special wasn't just their uniform. It was their serious faces, the stillness of their bodies, and the unwavering attention they gave to their duties. The guards did not smile, they did not talk, and they did not show any emotion, at least not in front of the crowds. To most people who came to see them, it seemed like a show, a performance. Tourists often took pictures, some even trying to get a reaction from the guards by waving or making funny faces. But the guards remained perfectly still, their expressions locked in seriousness. Many people thought it was funny, and some tried to make them smile or laugh, but it was all in vain. The guards were trained to remain as stoic as stone statues, no matter what happened around them. For many, the sight of the King's Guard was one of the highlights of their visit to London. They stood tall and proud, guarding one of the most important places in the country, the home of the royal family. The ceremony of the changing of the guard, where the soldiers switched shifts, was a grand spectacle that drew huge crowds. But outside of that, most of the time the guards stood in silence, their eyes scanning the area, their feet planted firmly on the ground, and their posture as straight as a board. It was a routine that had been repeated day after day for years, even centuries. The King's Guard had a long history, and their role was one of deep importance. They had been guarding the monarch for over 350 years, protecting the royal family and the palace from any threats. But while the job was incredibly important, it was also incredibly repetitive. Each guard stood in the same place in the same position, with the same expression on their face. They could stay like that for hours at a time, not moving a muscle. On this particular day, one of the guards was positioned near the gates of Buckingham Palace, as usual. He was a young man, probably in his mid-twenties, with a serious and focused expression. His red coat was immaculate, and his black bearskin hat sat perfectly on his head. His boots were polished to a shine, and his uniform was as crisp as if it had just been pressed. The guard's job was to stand watch, ensuring that no one entered the palace grounds without permission, and that everything remained peaceful and secure. It was a responsibility he took very seriously. But as he stood there unmoving, he couldn't help but notice the crowd of people around him. There were families, groups of friends, and tourists from every corner of the globe. They all stood in front of him, staring in awe at the famous King's Guard, some trying to take pictures, others simply staring, captivated by his stillness. It was almost as if they saw him not as a person, but as a living statue, a part of the grand performance of London. Despite the crowds, the guard kept his focus. He had been trained to ignore distractions, to tune out the noise and chaos around him. He was a professional, and his duty was to guard the palace. Yet, every so often, his gaze would wander. He would see the curious faces of children pressed against the barrier, their eyes wide with wonder. They often seemed to be studying him, trying to figure out how he could stand so still, why he never smiled, and how he could appear so serious when everything around him was so lively. Among the crowd was a young boy who stood out from the others. He was no more than 7 years old, with wide brown eyes and a face full of curiosity. His name was Ethan, and he had traveled with his parents all the way from a small town in the countryside to see London. Ethan had heard about the King's Guard from his teacher back home, and he was excited to see them in person. He had always been fascinated by soldiers, especially those who could stand so still for so long. As Ethan stood there watching the guard in front of him, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of awe. He had never seen anyone so serious, so focused, and so perfectly still. The more he watched, the more he found himself wondering how the guard did it. How could he stand there for hours, barely even moving? Did he get tired? Wasn't he bored? And most of all, Ethan wondered, could he make the guard smile? He had seen it before, tourists and children trying to make the guards laugh, make a silly face, or even wave to them. But the guard never reacted. They were always too serious, too disciplined, too focused on their duty. Ethan didn't want to just be another person trying to get the guard's attention. He wanted to do something different. Something that would actually make him smile, even just a little bit. Ethan had always been a cheerful and playful child. He was the kind of boy who loved to make people laugh, whether it was by telling jokes, doing funny dances, or simply being silly. He had a special gift for brightening up anyone's day. So, as he stood there, his curiosity growing, he decided he was going to do something no one else had tried. He was going to make the king's guard smile. He looked at his parents for a moment. They were both busy taking photos, not paying attention to him at that moment. Ethan saw his chance and decided to act quickly before the guard could spot him and stop. He was small, so he could sneak up without being noticed too easily. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart, and then, without another thought, he slowly inched closer to the front of the crowd. Ethan stopped just a few feet away from the guard. The young soldier was staring straight ahead, his eyes focused on something in the distance. He didn't even seem to notice Ethan's presence. But the boy didn't let that discourage him. He wasn't going to give up that easily. With a mischievous grin, Ethan took a step forward. He raised his small hand and, in the most gentle and playful way, waved it in front of the guard's face. His wave was slow and deliberate, almost as if he were trying to get the guard's attention without being rude. It was a simple gesture, but one that carried all of Ethan's hopes for the moment. Ethan stood there, his little heart racing with excitement. He had seen so many people, especially tourists, try to get the king's guard to smile, but no one ever seemed to succeed. Most people would wave, shout, or even make funny faces at the guard, but their serious expressions never changed. The guards were trained to ignore everything. They had to stay focused, no matter what distractions were around them. But Ethan wasn't like everyone else. He wasn't trying to shout or act silly. He wanted to do something different. He wanted to do something that would catch the guard's attention in a way no one else had. As he stood there, looking up at the guard with curiosity in his eyes, Ethan thought about how to approach this challenge. He knew he couldn't just act like everyone else. That wouldn't work. But he didn't want to make the guard feel uncomfortable either. He wasn't sure what to do, but his young mind was filled with ideas. Ethan had always been a cheerful child. He had a natural ability to bring a smile to people's faces. Whether it was with his silly dances, his funny little jokes, or the way he told stories, Ethan could always make others laugh. But here, in front of the guard, it wasn't just about making him laugh. It was about something more, a moment of connection. Ethan wanted to be kind, but also clever. As he glanced around, he saw people taking pictures, families standing together, and others just watching. But Ethan was focused. He wasn't paying attention to the noise of the crowd or the chatter of the tourists. All he could think about was the guard. He had a strange feeling that, in a way, the guard wasn't just standing there as part of a display. He was part of something much bigger, something important. That thought made Ethan feel even more determined. It wasn't just about making him smile. It was about showing him that he could do it in a way that was respectful, yet still playful. Ethan noticed how still the guard was. His feet were planted firmly on the ground and his posture was straight, almost too perfect. Every inch of his uniform was immaculate, every detail carefully maintained. The guard's face was locked in a serious expression, not a flicker of emotion in his blue eyes. Ethan wondered if he was ever allowed to smile or even have fun. He must have been doing this job for years, standing in the same place, doing the same thing every day. It must have been exhausting, but Ethan was sure the guard had never shown it. He never given anyone the satisfaction of cracking a smile. But Ethan wasn't ready to give up just yet. He believed that every person had a lighter side, a side that could laugh and enjoy life, no matter how serious their job was. Maybe, just maybe, the guard could smile too, if someone tried hard enough to bring that side out. Ethan's small face lit up with the idea, and without thinking much longer, he stepped a little closer to the guard. He felt the eyes of the crowd on him now, but he wasn't bothered. In fact, it made him feel more confident. His mission was clear and he was ready. Ethan knew he had to do something different. Something that wouldn't just get a reaction but would be clever enough to show the guard he was paying attention to him. He had to be respectful, but he also needed to be playful, a little bit cheeky, and definitely full of fun. He paused for a moment, thinking about all the things he had seen others do. He had watched tourists try to get the guard's attention by making silly faces, by standing really close, or by calling out things like smile or wave. But none of that worked. None of it ever made the guard smile. Ethan realized it wasn't about being loud or acting silly. It was about something more subtle. It was about the joy of the moment, about having the right kind of energy. It was about showing the guard that even in the most serious situations, there was room for a little bit of fun. Ethan thought about his favorite thing to do back home, playing with his friends. Sometimes, when they were all playing outside, he would pretend to be a soldier. He would stand like a statue, just like the king's guard, and his friends would try to make him laugh. They'd say things like, "You're a robot," or "You look like a tree," and Ethan would fight hard not to laugh. He realized then that it wasn't just about making the guard smile. It was about creating a moment of fun, something playful but unexpected. He decided to try something different. With a deep breath, he stepped closer to the guard, still maintaining his calm, innocent demeanor. Ethan knew that if he could just show the guard that he wasn't like all the others, maybe he would have a chance. So, with a grin on his face, he gently waved his hand in front of the guard, just enough for him to notice. It wasn't loud, it wasn't crazy. It was simply a quiet, playful wave. A small gesture, but one that might show the guard that Ethan wasn't there to disrupt or annoy him, but to share a quiet, friendly moment. Ethan didn't move or jump around like the others. He didn't make any noise. He simply waited, keeping his hand raised for just a few seconds. His small face filled with hope, and he stood perfectly still, watching the guard, waiting to see if he would react. The rest of the crowd continued snapping photos, some pointing their cameras at Ethan, thinking it was just another tourist interaction, but Ethan was lost in his own little world. He was focused entirely on the guard. The minutes seemed to drag by. Ethan was unsure if the guard had even noticed. The soldier's eyes remained focused, his expression as serious as ever. But Ethan, though a little nervous, wasn't discouraged. He knew that getting someone to smile wasn't easy, especially someone as serious as the king's guard. But there was something in Ethan's heart that told him not to give up. He just had to wait for the right moment. Sometimes, all it took was a little patience and a lot of heart. The crowd around them started to thin a little, but Ethan remained in place, his small hand still waving gently in front of the guard. And just as he began to wonder if this was all for nothing, something remarkable happened. For the briefest moment, the guard's lips twitched. Just a tiny movement, but it was enough. It was almost as if he couldn't hold it in any longer. A flicker of warmth passed through his serious expression, and the corner of his mouth curved up, ever so slightly. It was so subtle that at first Ethan wasn't sure if he had imagined it. But no, it was real. The guard had smiled. It wasn't a big, wide grin, but it was there. It was a small, barely noticeable smile, but it was a smile nonetheless. Ethan's eyes widened, and for a moment he couldn't believe it. He had done it. He had made the king's guard smile. It wasn't just a random smile, either. It was a smile that came from a place of surprise and maybe even a little joy. Ethan's heart swelled with happiness. He hadn't expected much, just a little flicker of recognition maybe, but this was more than he had hoped for. It felt like a small victory, something that made all the waiting and the effort worth it. Ethan stood there for a few more seconds, still in shock at what had just happened. The king's guard had smiled, well, just for a second, but it was enough to make Ethan feel like he had accomplished something truly special. His heart raced with excitement, and a huge grin spread across his face. For a moment, he almost forgot where he was. He had made the guards smile, and that was more than enough for him. The crowd around him didn't seem to notice what had just occurred. They were too busy snapping pictures, chatting, and making their way around the palace grounds. The tourists who had been gathered earlier were still milling about, some walking away, others lingering for one more look at the famous guard. But for Ethan, it didn't matter. In his eyes, this was a victory. The moment he had been hoping for had come to life, and now all he could do was stand there, soaking it all in. His parents hadn't noticed anything either. They were too caught up in taking photos of the palace and the guard to realize what had just happened right in front of them. Ethan's mother was chatting with his father about their next stop, and his father was busy adjusting the camera. But Ethan didn't mind. This moment was for him and the guard, a private, quiet exchange that no one else would understand. Still, he couldn't help but feel like he wanted to share his excitement. He wanted to tell his parents about the guard's smile, but he was worried that they wouldn't believe him. What if they thought he had imagined it? What if they didn't think it was a big deal? Ethan hesitated for a moment, then decided it didn't matter. He had seen it, and that was all that mattered. He was proud of himself, and that was enough. Ethan turned his attention back to the guard. The man was standing there again, perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the horizon. His serious expression had returned, and his posture was as flawless as ever. But to Ethan, something had changed. There was a little warmth in the guard's eyes now, even if no one else could see it. The boy had somehow managed to crack through the guard's stoic exterior, even if just for a brief moment. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The more Ethan thought about it, the more he realized how incredible this whole experience had been. He had come to London with no expectations, just wanting to see the famous King's Guard. But he had left with a story he would never forget. It wasn't just about making the guard smile. It was about connecting with another person in a way that was special, even in the most unlikely of situations. He had learned that sometimes the smallest actions could have the biggest impact. A wave, a gesture, a simple moment of kindness, those were the things that could make the world feel a little warmer. Ethan had known that all along. He had always believed that people, no matter who they were, could be kind, could smile, could share a moment of joy if you approached them the right way. And that's what he had done with the King's Guard. He hadn't shouted or acted crazy. He hadn't tried to force anything. Instead, he had simply shown the guard that he saw him as a person, not just a soldier. It was strange to think that just a few minutes ago, the guard had seemed so distant, so unreachable. But now, after that brief smile, everything felt different. Ethan felt a sense of pride, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, he had helped make the world feel a little bit more connected. It wasn't a big change, but it was a change nonetheless. The guard had shown him that even the most serious person could have a lighter side, a side that could smile, even if it was hidden behind a wall of discipline and duty. Ethan glanced up at his parents again. They were still taking pictures, oblivious to what had just happened. He smiled at the thought that he had experienced something that no one else had seen, something that no one else would believe. He had made the King's Guard smile, and that was enough to make him feel like the luckiest boy in the world. He began to walk back toward his parents, still in a daze, but as he turned, something caught his eye. The guard was watching him. Ethan paused for a second, wondering if he had imagined the connection, but then he saw it clearly. The guard's gaze had softened just for a moment. His eyes locked with Ethan's, and for a brief second it was as though they shared a quiet understanding. It wasn't much, a small acknowledgement that passed between them, but it felt real. Ethan felt a warmth in his chest. He had done something that mattered. Not for the crowd, not for anyone else, but for himself. And for the guard. The guard who had been so focused on his duty, who had seemed so distant, had shared something with him, something unspoken. It wasn't a big gesture, just a subtle shift in the guard's demeanor, but it felt important. Ethan smiled to himself, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. His parents were now ready to move on. They were gathering their things and starting to walk away, but Ethan stayed for a moment longer, looking back at the guard. The man's expression had returned to its serious state, and he was standing as still as ever. But Ethan knew something that no one else did. He knew that behind the mask of the stoic soldier, there was a person who could smile, even if it was just for a moment. With a final glance at the guard, Ethan turned to join his parents. He knew that the memory of this moment would stay with him for a long time. It would be one of those stories he would tell for years, the story of the day he made the king's guard smile. As they walked away, Ethan couldn't stop grinning. He had done it. He had made the guard smile. It was a simple thing, really, but it meant everything to him. And in that moment, as they left Buckingham Palace behind them, Ethan felt like he had won a small victory, a victory not of power or skill, but of kindness and the simple joy of making someone smile. As Ethan walked away from Buckingham Palace with his parents, he could still feel the excitement of the moment bubbling inside him. The smile from the king's guard, the one he had managed to get, even if it was only for a second, kept replaying in his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about it. He had made a soldier who had stood still for hours, unmoving and unyielding, smile. It seemed impossible, but somehow it had happened. The crowd was thinning out, and the noise around him started to fade as they walked down the path leading away from the palace. People were talking, children were laughing, and the busy London streets filled with the usual hustle and bustle. But to Ethan, everything felt different now. It was like the world had slowed down for a moment, and that moment had been just for him. His parents were talking to each other, asking what they should do next. They had planned to visit a few more places in London that day, but Ethan wasn't really listening to them. His mind kept drifting back to the guard. He had learned something important that day, something that would stick with him for the rest of his life. As they continued walking down the street, Ethan's thoughts wandered to the guard again. How had that tiny, almost imperceptible smile made him feel so proud? How could such a small action have such a big impact on his day? The smile wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't even something that everyone would have noticed. But to Ethan, it felt like a huge win. It felt like a victory not just for him, but for kindness itself. He thought about how serious the guard had seemed when he first saw him. The man had been standing there, looking like a statue, not reacting to anything around him. Ethan had wondered if the guard ever got tired, if he ever wished he could show some emotion, or even have a little fun. Ethan had always believed that everyone, even the most serious people, had a softer side. That side that was kind, playful, and capable of smiling. The kind of smile that could light up a room, even for just a second. That small smile from the guard had proven Ethan's belief to be right. It wasn't about making him laugh out loud or making a big show of it. It was about making a connection, a quiet, unspoken understanding that was shared for just a moment. Ethan realized that sometimes the most powerful moments weren't the loudest ones. They weren't the ones that got the most attention, but they were the ones that stayed with you, the ones that you carried in your heart long after they had passed. He looked up at his parents, but they were busy looking at their map, trying to decide where to go next. He wanted to tell them what had happened. He wanted to share with them how he had made the king's guard smile, but he wasn't sure how to explain it. How could he put that moment into words? It had felt so simple at the time, but now it felt so important. He had done something that many people had tried but never succeeded at. He had made someone who seemed unapproachable, distant, and serious show a little bit of warmth. It was like a secret he held inside, a special moment just for him. As they turned onto a busy street, Ethan noticed a group of tourists standing near a cafe, looking at a map. They were all trying to figure out where to go next, and their conversation was full of excitement and questions about what to see in London. Ethan smiled to himself. He knew they were probably thinking about all the famous landmarks and tourist spots they wanted to visit. Buckingham Palace, the Tower of London, Big Ben, those were all the places people talked about. But for Ethan, the memory of the day wasn't about any of those places. It wasn't about the palace, the changing of the guard, or even the pictures that had been taken. It was about the smile, the unexpected smile from a soldier who had stood still for hours, waiting for something to change. And for a brief moment it did. As his family continued walking, Ethan found himself wishing he could go back to the palace to see the guard again. But he knew that wouldn't be possible. The guard had his job to do, and Ethan had his own day of exploring London ahead. But he would always remember that moment. The feeling of having made a connection with someone, even if it was a small one. It wasn't something everyone could do. It took a certain kind of courage to approach a soldier who had never shown emotion, to stand there in front of him and try to make him smile. Ethan felt proud of what he had done. It wasn't about winning a game or getting the highest score. It wasn't about being the best at something. It was about a simple, quiet act of kindness, a gesture that could change the course of a day or maybe even a life. Ethan hadn't expected to accomplish something so special that day, but he had. He had made the guard smile, and in doing so, he had learned that sometimes the smallest things could make the biggest difference. As they continued on their way, Ethan couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. He knew that the guard, wherever he was still standing tall and still doing his job, keeping watch over Buckingham Palace. But Ethan also knew that the guard wasn't just a statue. He wasn't just a man in a uniform performing his duties. He was a person with emotions and a heart just like anyone else. And for a moment, Ethan had seen that side of him. It was a lesson Ethan would carry with him for the rest of his life. People are not always what they seem on the outside. Even the most serious, stoic, or distant people have moments of softness. They have sides of themselves that are kind, caring, and open to connection. It just takes someone who is willing to see beyond the surface, to look for that moment of warmth and kindness, and to reach out in a way that feels genuine. As they continued through the streets of London, Ethan's heart felt full. The day had started out like any other tourist visit, but it had turned into something extraordinary. He had made a soldier smile. That simple, quiet moment was something that would stay with him forever. And as they approached their next destination, Ethan knew he had learned something that day that would stay with him for a long time. It wasn't just about seeing the famous sights of London. It was about the small moments that made life special. The kindness, the smiles, and the connections that you made along the way. And most of all, it was about the reminder that even the most serious of people have a lighter side, waiting to be seen. As the day continued and Ethan's family made their way through the bustling streets of London, Ethan couldn't help but feel a warm glow inside him. The memory of the King's Guard's smile was like a little secret, one that he would carry with him forever. It wasn't just a smile. It was a moment of connection, something that had made the world feel a little smaller, a little kinder. Ethan didn't know if the guard had smiled because of him, or if it was just a fleeting moment of his own. Maybe the guard had been thinking of something else, or maybe, just maybe, the simple act of Ethan waving in front of him had broken through his serious exterior. Either way, Ethan knew that what had happened was special, and that was enough. As they walked along, Ethan found himself thinking about the power of small moments. He had always been told that it's the little things in life that matter the most, but that day, he had truly understood what that meant. It wasn't about big accomplishments or grand gestures. It wasn't about winning or being the best at something. It was about taking the time to notice the small things, the moments that often went unnoticed by others. Ethan had learned that sometimes, a simple wave or a smile could make all the difference. He couldn't help but think about the people around him, the tourists, the families, the children, all walking around, some of them caught up in their own little worlds, not even noticing what had just happened. They were too busy looking at the big sights and taking pictures, focused on the next place to visit. But Ethan knew that, in that moment, he had experienced something that would stay with him for a long time. The guard's smile was something that couldn't be captured in a photo or written down in a travel guide. It was a memory, a moment that was his and his alone. As they walked past the cafes and shops lining the streets, Ethan looked up at his parents. They were smiling, enjoying their time in London, talking about the next place they would visit. They were happy, and Ethan could see how much they appreciated the trip. But he knew that his memory of the day would always be different from theirs. While they might remember the famous landmarks and the iconic places they visited, Ethan would always remember the guard's smile. It would be the thing that made his trip to London unforgettable. Later that afternoon, as they sat down in a cafe to have a snack, Ethan's thoughts continued to drift back to the guard. He still couldn't believe it had happened. He had been so nervous when he first saw the guard, so unsure of how to approach him. But somehow he had managed to break through the serious soldier's tough exterior, even if just for a moment. It made him realize something important, that everyone, no matter how serious or unapproachable they might seem, had a softer side. A side that could be reached if you were patient, kind, and genuine. Ethan had always believed that everyone had the ability to be kind, even if they didn't always show it. He had seen it in his friends, his teachers, and even in strangers he had met along the way. But that day, he had learned that the same kindness and warmth existed in places where you wouldn't expect to find it. The king's guard, who had seemed so serious, had shown him that even the most disciplined and focused people could have a lighter side. Sometimes all it took was the right moment, the right gesture, and the right person. As the day turned into evening, Ethan found himself walking back toward Buckingham Palace with his parents. They had decided to return one last time to see the changing of the guard ceremony, which had been scheduled for later that afternoon. But as they approached the palace gates, Ethan didn't feel the same excitement he had felt earlier. He wasn't focused on seeing the guard again or taking more pictures. Instead, he was thinking about the memory he had created that morning. He had made a soldier smile, and that was enough for him. The rest of the trip felt like a bonus, a chance to see new things, but nothing would ever compare to the quiet connection he had shared with the king's guard. As they stood near the gates, waiting for the changing of the guard to begin, Ethan looked around at the crowd. Everyone seemed excited, taking photos, talking about their travels. But for Ethan, there was a quiet sense of peace. He knew that while the changing of the guard was a grand, ceremonial event, the most important thing he had experienced that day wasn't something that could be captured by a camera or witnessed by a large crowd. It was the small moment he had shared with the guard, the smile, the connection, the understanding, and that was something no one else would ever fully appreciate. As the ceremony began and the soldiers marched past, Ethan watched with interest, but his mind kept drifting back to that moment. He knew that someday he would return to London and stand at those same gates again. But next time, it wouldn't be to try and make the guards smile. Next time, it would be to simply remember that day. The day when a small, quiet moment taught him the power of kindness and the importance of seeing the world not just for its famous landmarks, but for the people in it. Ethan's family eventually made their way to the next place on their list, but Ethan kept the memory of the guard's smile close to his heart. It was a reminder that even the most serious people had moments of lightness, that even the busiest days could hold a small act of kindness that could change the course of a day. And most of all, it was a reminder that the world, despite all its busyness and noise, could still offer moments of true connection, if you just knew how to look for them. As the family boarded the bus to their next destination, Ethan sat quietly by the window, watching the streets of London roll by. He thought about all the people who had crossed his path that day, tourists, locals, strangers, and he wondered if anyone else had experienced something as meaningful as he had. He hoped they had. He hoped that in their own way everyone could find a small moment of kindness, a quiet smile or a shared connection just like he had. But for now, Ethan was content. He had his memory and that was enough. The king's guard, who had once seemed like an untouchable figure, had become a part of his story, a story that would stay with him, a story he could tell for years to come.